This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. Hello, everyone. I know a lot of you follow this podcast because you're interested in sustainable finance, and in particular, how we can hopefully create new sovereign bond instruments and mobilize private capital into emerging and frontier markets. Because as we all know, meeting these global needs around climate change requires a lot of money. So we need to get creative. So today's guest is here to explain how some of these countries are meeting these challenges. And we're very honored to have Herman Kamil here today, who is the director of the debt management unit of Uruguay, which, as many of you know, is the second country to issue a sustainability-linked bond and the first country to issue one that had both a step up and a step down coupon. So, Herman, I'm so honored that you agreed to come on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Hello, Jill, and thank you very much for the invitation. And also, it's a pleasure to be here and share the experience of Uruguay on sustainable financing.
So before we get into the details of the transaction, which I know we will, could you tell us, just set the stage for us a little bit about the challenges facing Uruguay? We know that in many countries, the challenge is really about mitigation, about lowering emissions, whereas other countries, it's about transitioning to renewable energy or just finding energy sources for their development. Others, it's more about adaptation and changing growing seasons or drought or desertification. Could you just, as to kick us off, just kind of set the scene for us, for those listeners that might not be as familiar with Uruguay, and just tell us what you're coping with on the ground?
Sure. Let me provide some context then, because many, as you say, many who may be listening in may not be familiar with a small country like Uruguay. Over the past 30 years, Uruguay has been able to grow its economy, but at the same time, significantly reducing the greenhouse gas emissions across many of these economic sectors. In particular, Uruguay is now one of the leading countries in terms of sustainable electricity generation, and that has a lot to do with a substantial shift to renewable sources of electricity production that happened in my country over the last 10 years. Now, beyond electricity generation, also public policies in Uruguay have prompted substantial investments and technological changes in the cattle raising industry, which is a key sector in Uruguay. And that has allowed to reduce the intensity of methane emissions, which is also, we know, has global warming effects coming from beef production. But beyond greenhouse gas emissions, in Uruguay, also, the country has made the protection of natural ecosystems a key part of the country's environmental strategy. And as we're going to talk in a minute, part of the design of the bond is to incorporate the goals of preserving natural capital in Uruguay, and particularly making sure that agricultural activity is not, as it is in much of the world, a driver of deforestation. Now, despite these large strides that we have done in terms of reducing the carbon intensity of the economy, we need to take additional steps to tackle climate change. And the country needs to accelerate the decarbonization in, say, heavy transportation, but also as a food supplier with an increasing world population, Uruguay needs to meet the challenge to feed the world, but at the same time to reduce methane emissions, while preserving its unique grassland ecosystem. So that's the context for the financial innovation in sovereign bond finances that we have undertaken over the last couple of years.
So in other words, like the environmental kind of concerns or strategies are an integral part of the country's development plan. This isn't something kind of extra or externally kind of driven. This is really kind of an internal part of your development plan.
Indeed, we are focused on achieving inclusive economic growth, but while mitigating the impacts of climate change, but also remaining a steward of our natural resources, and that includes protecting biodiversity.
So we understand the kind of the priority of the environment to Uruguay. And so then the question is like, okay, how do you finance this? And then how do you place this financing within the context of the rest of your financing plans? So when you as debt manager are kind of looking out over the horizon of what's available, there are a lot of different types of financing. There's kind of just plain use of proceeds bonds, and then there's these performance linked bonds, which is what you've chosen. Can you kind of walk us through your thought process of why you chose this KPI linked bond, a bond that's linked to a performance vis-a-vis a key performance indicator versus just a ring fenced green bond, kind of a more, let's say, kind of conventional at this point? And we'll get to like why you didn't even just go for just a plain vanilla bond, but maybe that's the first question: is why go for one of these special kind of sustainable finance bonds, and then why in particular the KPI linked? What was your thinking in that?
Yes, so I think that's a very good question, because say up until October last year in 2022, which when we issued our first sustainable SLB, sustainable financing bond, Uruguay had only issued plain vanilla bonds in dollars, in local currency, in yens. So as we entertain the possibility of integrating the strong ESG foundations of the country into our sovereign financing, the question was, should we pursue a more traditional use of proceeds bonds, like a green bond, for example, or should we look into what Chile had done a few months before, which is a performance-based approach, which is mostly a route that has been taken by corporates so far.
Exactly.
And we, in the end, we decided to go with a performance-based approach. And basically, we saw several appealing features in developing finance instruments that are linked to the performance of environmental indicators of a country. So let me walk you through and break it down into the reasons why we thought it was particularly appealing for a country like Uruguay. And I'm going to break it down from the point of view of the issuer, in this case Uruguay, but also from the point of view of the potential investor that in the end is our client, is the one that is supposed to be buying the bond. So first, what we liked about going with a performance-based approach is that it provided us with a chance to connect very clearly our debt management strategy to the goals in the Paris Agreement. And by doing so, we were strengthening the commitment of the country to our sustainability agenda. In other words, we were enhancing the accountability and the credibility of the country to climate action. So when you connect your debt management strategy, when you align your debt management strategy to your Paris Agreement goals, basically what you're doing is you're raising the profile and the stakes of your commitment.
But some would say, well, why would you do that? Like, isn't that making it harder on yourselves?
Oh, it is definitely taking a much bigger commitment, because what you're doing is you're saying we are prepared to walk the talk. And in this case, what you're showing is the country's resolve, politically, technically, to turn your goals in the Paris Agreement, which are based on your NDCs, into basically a financially binding commitment. So this is a very big leap for an emerging market country. It's really forging a bold new pathway. And we are of the view that by making that commitment, indeed, we are raising the stakes, but we are also bringing potential benefits for the country that goes over and beyond a bond issuance as a financing strategy, but it's also a statement about the country that could have benefits in other areas of our relationships with the world. For example, trade integration, diplomatic connections, statements in the international forums. Now, the second reason why we think is an interesting instrument for a sovereign is because it puts the focus more on outcomes, on results, on delivery, on climate performance objectives, and what are the actions that you need. That this is not to belittle that when you do a green bond, you're also putting the focus on how you're going to use those proceeds. But here the focus is more on the actual outcomes. So it really sets the stage for a country not only to set goals which are ambitious, but also having to accomplish that on a predefined timeline. And in our case, as we're gonna develop later, this timeline is very tight. Is through 2025.
No, exactly. So it seems like like you say, you raised the stakes even higher for yourselves. Now, was there like a financial benefit to doing that? I see that you're talking about these other kind of ancillary benefits of credibility and ambition and perhaps kind of with trade partners, even diplomatic pluses. But from a financial point of view, was there what people call a greenium? Did you feel like you achieved like a better pricing, or were you able to access a new investor base? Was there a financial incentive as well to pursuing this more challenging road that you took?
Yes, indeed, we think there were several there were several benefits that we saw. We also have to remember that when we came out to the market, it was quite a challenging backdrop, and still we were very satisfied with the market's broad embrace, not only of the concept of an SLB, which continues to be quite rare for the sovereign, but remember we were introducing for the first time a potential step-down feature for a global SLB in such a challenging environment. And what we really were very satisfied is that we saw that investors incorporated the notion that a country's potential environmental outperformance can lead to lower credit risk. And I think that's one of the big messages that came out of the outcome of our transaction, meaning we had almost 200 investors that were willing to invest in a bond where a potential outperformance of our goals will lead to a lower coupon. But underlying that concept was that the overall performance of the bond could improve if the country were to overperform on its targets. I would say that beyond the pricing itself, the investor backing for the trade was solid. We had a large and diverse, high-quality investor base from almost 200 investors. More than 30% of the allocated accounts were ESG dedicated, and interestingly, approximately 40 accounts participated in Uruguayan transactions for the first time.
You did feel like you reached kind of new investors.
Yes, not only did we reach new investors, but it was interesting because we also were by incorporating this ESG component in an environmental performance bond, we were able to tap into the pool of different funds within the same investor account, right? So what happened in the case of Uruguay is that our MB spreads are very tight, okay, compared to the rest of Latin America. So several investors were saying, well, we like Uruguay, but it's pricey. The fact that we introduced this SLB component improved on the pool of resources that we could tap even within the same investor account. So sometimes the potential benefit doesn't necessarily come from increasing the number of names from different accounts, but within accounts, being able to access different pool of money.
So instead of just hitting kind of the emerging market pool of money, you reached into their other pools of money that were ESG or allocated for some other purposes
within the same investor
within the
name.
Same kind of the home
umbrella.
umbrella.
Yes. And then on let me say something, maybe it's a little bit technical, but I think it's important to highlight, because a lot of the discussion is sometimes framed in terms, well, did you get a greenium or didn't you get any greenium? Was it worth all the investment, all the time, all the work for 2 years? Did you see any price benefit? It's important to say that estimating the greenium or the SLBinium, if I may,
exactly,
it's more art than science. And people who are involved in the market and book runners know that, because first, what you need to do to estimate the greenium is to estimate what is the new issue premium on your issuance. And as you know, yield requires comparing the yield at issuance with what would be the fair value in secondary markets, and you can only estimate that. That's not observable. It requires certain assumptions. But no, it's not only about estimating the new issue premium, which in itself can be debatable, but then you have to compare that new issue premium to what would have been the new issue premium if you had issued a plain vanilla bond, meaning a bond that is exactly the same, except that it doesn't have an SLB feature. So as you can see, estimating the greenium can be hard. So all we can say, and I think it's important for those interested in the concept of step up or step down, one is that we found no evidence that investors charged us an additional surcharge for accepting the potential of a step down. I think that's, rather than thinking in terms of greenium, we need to think of whether investors were requiring any potential compensation for the possibility of a step down.
Was there any charge against you for doing such a...
Exactly. What I can tell you, and maybe as an anecdote that may be interesting for those that are listening in, is the deal was launched on the back of a very extensive marketing campaign. We engaged over a year and a half. We engaged more than 115 different investors' accounts. Right. So as you can imagine, it was a long campaign, and we had to provide accounts with a lot of background as to many of the questions you're asking. What was our LSFB strategy? What was the rationale for the contemplated structure? What were the details on the infrastructure that we had to put in place in connection with the whole process? Ministry coordination, verification, reporting, tracking, interactions with ICMA, with rating agencies, with index providers. So you can imagine the whole span of the process. Now, at the beginning, back in mid-2021, remember, we issued the bond in October 2022. We faced a lot of pushback on the notion of a step down. This notion had not been tested before. All SLBs that had been issued up until then, including Chile's in February 2022, only had a step, meaning it only had a penalty in case you missed the goals, but the coupon will remain the same if you met or overachieve your goals. So at the beginning there was a lot of pushback, Jill. People were saying, investors were saying that it wasn't consistent with the fiduciary mandate, for example, or that their systems were not thought to incorporate a step down.
Model. It's too hard to model, Herman.
Hard to model. But I'm not saying this in a pejorative way. I'm saying there were a lot of reasons that investors were coming up to say, no, I don't feel comfortable having a step down. And yet, as time went by and we continued to showcase the Uruguay's experience, explain the rationale, and basically telling to investors, look, this is not coming out of our need to do it. It's not that we need to issue a bond like this one. And we are trying to do this to really raise the stakes and further commit to a sustainability agenda, because our bonds, the plain vanilla ones, the ones that you have a yield curve now, already are incorporating our ESG premium. We were telling investors, look, we are already benefiting because JP Morgan's ESG adjusted MB, Uruguay's weight in that MB, ESG adjusted, is twice the traditional MB. So we are already getting the demand for ESG in our plain vanilla bonds. So this is not coming out of needs, it's coming more out of virtue. And I think that resonated with investors, the fact that we wanted to go one step ahead. And then the other thing that resonated, Jill, with investors, as we discussed the step up and step down, is say, look, the focus shouldn't be only on the coupon. Meaning, in case Uruguay overachieves its targets and you have a step down, and again, it's very, very ambitious, I should say. It's not the most likely scenario, but in case we overachieve our goals and there's a reduction in the coupon, that doesn't mean that the investor will be worse off. Because many investors were saying, okay, I'm going to price this bond to the worst case scenario for me, which is that you overachieve your goals. No, we said we don't agree. If we overachieve our goals, probably what's going to happen is that the price of our bonds are going to go up because our credit fundamentals would increase because ESG would be incorporated in our credit strength.
Right.
So once you start framing the discussion, instead of saying, hey, a step down is a stick, it's a hit on the investor, and you substitute that by saying, if we overachieve, actually what you're doing is you're strengthening your credit fundamentals. Once you frame the conversation that way, then it's easier to see why the incentives of investors and issuers are aligned. And the same way, if Uruguay has to pay a step up, meaning if we do not meet our goals, Uruguay should not see the step up as a penalty. We shouldn't see the step up as a penalty. We should see it as a compensation to the investor that was willing to take a vote of confidence on the country that it would achieve its goals. And if for some reason it does not achieve its goals, probably the price of our bonds will go down. And a step up is just partially compensating the investor for that.
I like the way you frame that in the sense that it's not a penalty, because I think a lot of people think of it along those, and that's one of why many of us struggle with the idea of a step up coupon in the sovereign space, is that, well, wait a minute, if a country is failing to achieve their goals, why would you suddenly then start beating them up? why charge them more when they're actually struggling?
Actually, what is true is that this kind of SLB structures have a procyclical risk, meaning that your coupon will, from the point of the issuer, is a procyclical risk because your coupon will go up whenever you miss your goals, which typically could happen under exceptional circumstances. But we had another investor say that we're saying it's not that we don't like the step down, we don't like the step up, said some investor, because we are going to be seen as rooting for failure. You shouldn't be rooting for an increasing coupon, because probably when the coupon increases, your overall returns would actually decrease because the credit of the country could potentially suffer.
So what you're saying is that the investor and the issuer are aligned, in fact, and that you do all want the targets to be met, not for just some feel-good, save the planet reason, but actually for financial reasons, because it's a strengthening of the credit story and it's a strengthening of Uruguay.
And the other thing we were telling investors, even those that did not participate, we were telling investors, look, whenever there is a bond transaction, everybody participates, even those that are not in the order book. Every investor holding Uruguay participates because the price of the whole yield curve changes whenever you have an issuance.
Right.
Several investors that did not participate in the SLB for the reasons that could be fair or for any reason actually should be rooting for Uruguay to perform or overperform, because that would have an impact in the whole yield curve, not only on the SLB.
Right.
So that's how we try to cast the conversation in terms of a mechanism for distributing risks and compensations across investors and across issuers without appealing to the notions of a penalty, but rather more about overall the way you integrate your credit risk, the way you integrate ESG foundations into credit risk, and how that gets translated into the market price of your bonds. That's how we want to cast it.
Along that idea of the benchmark, because that's one of the things that we have heard that are a concern of some issuers, of just saying, well, how does this fit in? And if we have too many thematic bonds or special bonds in our portfolio, like it kind of messes up the yield curve. Like, you don't see it that way. Or what is your response to that?
So far, we haven't had any evidence of that. The 2034 bond has seemed to have integrated nicely to the rest of the yield curve. It could happen, though, that as you get closer to 2025 or actually to 2027, when we're going to get the data on verification, what is going to be interesting is that the relative prices of the bond could help you back out to have a market-based measure of the probability that the market assigns to meeting your goals based on the pricing.
Right.
And in fact, there are a couple of the Jalil, which is an academic that has been working a lot into SLBs, and co-authors have been trying to study and to try to back out the implicit probability of hitting your goals based on corporate SLBs. I had a chance to discuss with him and his co-author on how to measure this for a sovereign like Uruguay. But so far, we haven't yet seen any kind of deviation. If anything, we have been surprised by the strong increase in secondary market prices since we issued. Part of it has been due to the fact that there's been a repricing in the U.S. yield curve. But still, once you adjust for that, we've seen a very nice run in the price of the SLB in the secondary market. So overall, we feel good not only about the outcome of the primary transaction, Jill, but it's also very important to see how it performs in the secondary market.
Right. And we kind of skipped over, and that's my fault, but the actual KPIs. You mentioned, kind of the natural capital and the forest, but can you just walk us through how you chose those particular KPIs and that process? I think you were working with UNDP on that, but I might be wrong. In this particular bond, there are 2 KPIs, but how did you decide, and what is the monitoring kind of burden going forward on that? Does this bond add to that burden, or is this things you were going to be doing anyway?
Okay, so basically what we did then in a nutshell was to link our bond financing strategy to certain climate and nature targets that were already established under the Paris Agreement. So we're building a bridge between the world of climate finance and the world of climate change, right? So, and to do that, we set up goals with respect to 2 key performance indicators. The first one was reducing the intensity of greenhouse gas emissions in the economy, meaning total emissions as a share of real GDP. And the second KPI was preserving the native forest area in the country. This second one actually resonated very much, was very well received, particularly among European investors. So why did we decide to go with those 2 KPIs? Well, we think they address 2 different but complementary environmental global public goods. The first one is about mitigating global warming, and the second one is about preserving a key carbon sink, which is the native forest. The SPTs, meaning the performance targets for those KPIs, were based on quantitative goals that were set for 2025 and were established in the National Determined Contribution that Uruguay published in 2017. And here I want to highlight something that sometimes gets overlooked. These targets on these 2 KPIs were exogenous, meaning predetermined to the decision to issue the bond, meaning in this, when we set the targets in 2017, there was no discussion whatsoever about having a bond based on them. So that adds, I think, to the integrity of the whole project. Now, these 2 targets imply, as I was saying at the beginning, making additional strides to achieve to cut Uruguay's aggregate gross emissions by half, while maintaining 100% of its native forest cover. Now, this second one, maintaining the 100% of our native forest area, implies a net zero deforestation commitment. And this, as I was saying, resonated very strongly with accounts that value a lot the conservation of natural capital and the protection of biodiversity. And as you know, this came out, this was at the forefront of the discussion, particularly in COP26 and also again in COP27. So once we set the KPIs and the SPTs, a very important part of any sustainability linked bond framework is the reporting and the verification approach that underpins the framework, right? Because you can have very good KPIs, very good SPTs, step up, step down, but if your reporting and verification is not strong and credible, it would be very difficult for the instrument to take off.
Doesn't that add a lot of costs to the government? I mean, beyond the just kind of transaction costs, again, kind of trying to be a little bit devil's advocate here, or kind of trying to pick it and echo things that I've heard from so many other countries where they're kind of, reluctant to go down this route.
No, definitely. and you're being an advocate, I was, because indeed this is because indeed this is something that we thought about ourselves. I mean, because okay, if you want to make the reporting to be accurate, if your availability of data has to be timely, if the disclosure has to be transparent, you have to have a verification, an external verification that is credible.
That's all hard to do in some places. Well, at anywhere, actually.
It's very hard. And in fact, that's why it almost took us 2 years to put together with a lot of interministerial coordination. And I would highlight two things that we were able to accomplish. The first one is to move from reporting greenhouse gas emissions from biennial to annual frequency. So we put it in line with the standards of most developed economies. For example, the US and Europe report their greenhouse gas emissions every year. And Uruguay starting in May this year, going to start reporting every year. And the other thing that we had to do for forest area cover is to use geospatial data and satellite image mapping to estimate the native forest area every 4 years, which again is quite demanding. And finally, we also committed, and this was an innovation in the whole process of the bond, to have an external and independent and a qualified review conducted by the United Nations Development Program. The UNDP had never before been willing to provide its auditing process for a country on its KPI throughout the whole life of an SLB. So that in itself was a statement of backing Uruguay. So to your question on indeed, I would say to people that are listening in and maybe entertaining the possibility of developing an SLB, yes, it's challenging, it's resource intensive, because you need to develop the reporting for the sustainability bonds. You need to establish a lot of interministerial coordination, but also it has a lot of benefits, Jill, of developing this reporting, because, for example, we had to work with 5 different ministries, and you start seeing that you start creating champions for sustainable finance in different ministries. And that also leads to a more harmonized communication across the government and how you discuss the different trade-offs. And that in itself would help you to achieve the goals. So the whole sustainability reporting is a journey, and you cannot let the perfect be enemy of the good. What's important is to get started and to be committed to continuous progress over time.
It's interesting you mentioned that interministerial coordination, because Potomac Group helped produce a guide for debt managers who are considering kind of sustainable finance instruments. And we came up with 7 steps. And the first step is that interministerial coordination. And when we talk to governments, that's the one that's kind of the hardest to get going. But you're absolutely right, is once you start getting it going, suddenly you have people in the Ministry of Finance talking to Ministry of Environment, and then fisheries and labor, and everyone, energy, everybody starts getting involved, and as you say, starts kind of aligning the goals together. It makes it very concrete, but it is a challenge.
Let me underscore that. First of all, we were aware of the work that Potomac Group and you and yourself were doing on sustainable finance, and in fact, your work is cited in a sustainability bond framework document with our World Bank colleagues on the sustainability linked debt hub that has been recently launched. And indeed, this is a key issue: is that the SLB framework that we put together is a whole of government approach. It doesn't belong only to the Ministry of Finance, but rather it has to be an economy-wide effort, because the greenhouse gases are economy-wide, and they involve the Ministry of Industry, they involve the Ministry of Cattle Raising and Livestock, they involve obviously the Ministry of Finance, they involve the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Foreign Relations. But what's interesting is that that strong interministerial coordination and the governance arrangements that you need to put together are going to be critical to ensure that you have a timely and reliable provision of data, and that you communicate clearly and regularly on the progress in achieving those targets. But
Right.
that in itself will help you to maximize the chances to hit the goals. So
Exactly.
in other words, the whole process in itself will be self-reinforcing with regards to the targets you need to achieve.
Well, and as you said earlier, the whole process also creates this virtuous circle in terms of governance and in terms of your credit story. So as you start kind of communicating and coordinating and working towards these goals, and as you start achieving these goals and you set the goals and you monitor them and then you hit them, you start to improve the whole story. So I think it's actually a very powerful tool, which is why we're so excited about it.
And what I would add to that, Jill, if I may, is
Please.
when in thinking about the potential benefits of a structure like this, we were talking about, say, from a point of view of an issuer, that it raises your profile, underscores your credibility to climate action. It puts a focus on outcomes. It makes it incentive compatible because you have a better distribution of risks and compensations. But I would like to also emphasize that when we thought about putting together this instrument, we also focus on the demand side, not only on the supply side. We had to have an eye put on, okay, so who will potentially be buying these instruments? And one important development that happened at COP26 was that you had 450 major financial institutions that are now committed to making their portfolio net zero by 2050. So the question is, how is that capital going to be put to use?
Exactly.
So if you have private finance that is focused on a net zero carbon future, then if you come up with financial instruments that integrate and look to comply with Paris-aligned goals, then you will be able to attract more demand at scale and to meet the country's investment needs. Also, what I'm trying to say is that we also need to think on how we develop financing instruments that are not only fit for purpose for the country, but also for those potential investors that see their mandates evolving.
Exactly. The ESG money is somewhat tilted towards like buy Sweden or buy Northern Europe, right? And we've had an earlier episode on that, of how just some of those kind of scoring systems kind of skew to developed countries. And so exactly that, it's like trying to kind of develop something that also kind of can bend some of that money into other markets where it's needed. Absolutely. Which actually is a good segue into my next question, which is many countries, particularly in today's markets, aren't really having perfect access to the market, let's say, and aren't in a position such as Uruguay. For those countries who may be interested in raising finance one way or another, might need some sort of credit enhancements or some other helps. And there's a lot of talk about sustainable finance, but that incorporates other kind of bells and whistles to make it happen. And I know this might not be, what Uruguay has to think about, but just from your perspective, do you think, given your experience with the SLB, is this something that could lend itself to additional bells and whistles of credit enhancement, of partial guarantees, even some of the insurance products?
Oh, definitely. I think there is I think not only there's a compelling opportunity, but I think there's an urgent need to do that. And while it doesn't apply directly to the case of Uruguay, I had a chance to talk to several times to our colleagues from the World Bank, Fiona Stewart and Anderson Caputo, who you know, and they have been leading intellectually this the project on trying to integrate the notion of an SLBs, but more focus into countries that, on the one hand, are struggling with this debt nature climate challenge, but have lower rated sovereigns with more difficult market access. No, so the question is, and in that sense, I think the use of credit enhancements is key to try to improve market access and to allow those countries to access affordable financing and the investment that they urgently need to create a sustainable economy. In fact, the most recent IMF Global Financial Stability Report, it includes a strong message that says that it's very important to scale up private climate finance, and for that, it will require new financing instruments where that will require the involvement of MDBs and to attract private financing, and that's basically a subtle way of saying you will need those guarantees. So basically, our colleagues at the World Bank, and I also know part of my group has been part of this endeavors, has been thinking, okay, what are the main challenges of scaling up this sustainability-linked financing instruments for market access when there is a mismatch between the risk return of the risk return profile of the issuer and the risk return appetite of the lender, right? So, and that's where the credit enhancements come in, or how to better use the concessional capital that you have from DFIs and MDs. No, now one thing that has been emphasized, and I agree with that, is that for the case of countries that have more weaker market access or credit profiles, it's very important to design structures that are as simple as standardized as possible. So the one risk that you run when you're trying to fit many bells and whistles is that you end up with creating niche debt instruments that can reduce the liquidity in sovereign debt markets. So then to summarize it, I definitely think there is an opportunity to develop performance-based instruments tied to environmental indicators with the support of MDBs that can provide some kind of credit enhancements, and that aligns the goals of climate enhancement together with accessing capital at a lower cost. I definitely think there is a lot of work that can be done there.
No, fantastic. I think there's also, even for countries that are in distress, I don't know if you feel that these can also be coming out of bond exchanges and debt exchanges, as we may or may not see more and more countries having to kind of sit down with creditors, that this could be an interesting, I wouldn't say win-win, because obviously those are very hard situations for all involved, but a way where both debtor and creditor can come out with some interesting outcomes.
I agree, because whenever you're talking about climate change indicators, protecting biodiversity, protecting the forests, you're talking about global public goods. Mm-hmm. And so that offers an opportunity for the issuer and the lender to find a common ground, because exactly. The issuer's actions have a positive externality on the rest of the world. So definitely, debt for nature swaps, for example, that are now being discussed with more intensively, underpinning is the notion that whatever a country does, it also has positive externalities on other countries, including those creditors that for some reason are having trouble collecting their debt service.
No, absolutely. Well, I'm very conscious of time, so my last question is a bit of a tradition at this point, where we give the guests the last word. So a lot of our listeners are both, as far as we understand, we're in a lot of countries at this point, we know, and kind of a combination between the policymakers and decision makers, as well as a lot of issuing countries and debt managers. So one last piece of advice or your last word to them, what would you say to them as they kind of considering looking at an SLB or a sustainable finance instrument?
Well, first of all, thanks again for having me in the podcast. I would first go back to basics. No? I mean, I think that meeting the Paris Agreement goals to address climate change is among the top priorities of humanity. No? And it's what it would ensure that we have a livable and just future for all. So if that's one important premise, then financial markets can help create a green future by encouraging climate performance. So in other words, we need to harness financial incentives to address climate change. And I think that's the basic notion that was underpinning our SLB and the two-way pricing structure. And we think SLBs, particularly if they have this symmetric pricing structure, is a meaningful way to empower countries to follow through on their pledges and live up to their stated commitments. Remember, there are 190 countries that have an NDC out there, so the commitments are already out there. The question is, how are we going to create the incentives for countries to live up to those goals? So the fact that you have an economic consequence to our targets that you set incentivizes countries to make those targets a strategic priority, particularly if that comes with a potential reduction in borrowing costs. Then that's a powerful incentive for governments to take climate action. So that's basically the whole notion underpinning the SLBs that we put together. Because in the end, if you think about it, at the end of the day, investors that put their money in this kind of instruments want to know that they are having a real impact, because that's what their clients are demanding. But on the other hand, issuers want to be sure that their efforts and all the work that needs to be done are adequately rewarded. So that's why we need to think about these SLBs as a joint endeavor between issuers and investors, and aligning their incentives. Now, just as a final word, I would say, even with all the work it can take, and it really demands a lot of transversality across the government, we still think it's worth pursuing. Obviously, each country will have its own limitations, idiosyncrasies, hurdles. But again, we shouldn't make the perfect be enemy of the good. You should start with a basic sovereign structure framework that is credible, that allows for frequent and clear reporting, and also make sure that you have good external verification. And then also the one thing that was very important for us, and I will conclude with this idea, is very important to get feedback from investors early on. Very, very early on, even if that feedback at the beginning is not very forthcoming. And you need to continue to persevere, particularly because if you incorporate that feedback in your design of the instrument, then once you bring it to the market, it provides a different level of confidence to investors. Now, you won't be able to please everyone with a product. It's like a DJ. You would never please everyone with the songs it put in. But again, at least you know that you have a common denominator, a backing, where you showed that you were willing to make the effort to incorporate those features that would provide confidence to investors. For example, early on, we noticed that the native forest indicator resonated very much with investors, and they wanted that because they didn't have instruments that they could invest directly into biodiversity. The importance of having KPIs verifications that are halfway the life cycle of the bond.
Yep.
Investors didn't like KPIs that got verified 1 or 2 years before maturity.
Right.
Very important to have that verification happen even after the trigger, because investors were saying, well, once you get verified, what are the incentives left?
Right. Then you go out there with the chainsaw.
If you collected the step down, or if you have a step up, you still have 5-6 years left of the bond. What are the incentives left? And that we said, well, the incentive is to be reporting every year, because you make sure you have the market discipline every year. So those are the kind of examples where we collected that feedback, but it took almost a year. But again, for us, it was worth pursuing.
No, and hopefully, since you forged the path forward, so perhaps for others behind you, it will be a little bit easier. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for sharing your story. And thank you even more for this incredible work that you've been doing. And we look forward to seeing more innovations coming out of Uruguay. Thank you so much, Herman.
No, thank you, Jill, and congratulations for having this space, this this podcast where you showcase this kind of sustainability finance innovations that is helpful for everybody.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.